Hi everybody. This video will be just a complete tour of all the systems that are on the Phoenix. I know that a lot of people have never even seen or heard of any of these systems because there's 17 of them, and you might only be familiar with a few. So this is just a quick introduction to every single system that are on here. They're laid out alphabetically for you to go through the menu, but for this we're going to go chronologically so you can get an understanding of the timeline and kind of the history of video games. So the first game system I'm going to talk about is pretty much the original system that, as far as everyone knows, the Atari 2600, which came out in 1977. There were about 500 official games made for it. Uh, for some reason, back then they didn't really care much about copyright infringement or stealing intellectual property or anything because there was thousands of bootleg games and variations on official games that had been released that were being sold. And at one point, there was probably around 10,000 different games made for Atari, which led to a lot of confusion by customers and almost a complete destruction of the video game market in 1983. But the official games were great, and there are a lot of fun games that you can try playing. A lot of old games that you probably recognize just from playing computer games. Things like Centipede, games like Frogger or Asteroid or Pitfall, which was a lot of people's favorite game for this system. Uh, there's also a lot of fun games that you might not know, like games like Tapper, which you're a bartender trying to serve drinks, and Enduro, which is a really great racing game if you want to try that one out. But you can try them all out for yourself. Up next is Nintendo, the original Nintendo Entertainment System that came out in 1985 after Atari had failed and the smoke kind of cleared. Nintendo came out with the Nintendo Entertainment System, and was the biggest success in video game history, pretty much. Just a quick note that the peripherals that came with the system are definitely not going to work on the Phoenix, like things like the gun for Duck Hunt and other games, and the trackpad, which I definitely wouldn't be able to attach even if you had one. So games that use those are not going to be playable, even though I did include them just so that you'd have the complete library if you want to take a look at them. You're not going to be able to play them. There are 744 games you can play on this system. Everybody's favorites that everybody knows, probably like Super Mario and Zelda and Metroid and dozens of others. You don't really need me to explain this one for you. So the next system So the next system is the Sega Master System, which was Sega's first system that they tried to make. It came out 1 year after the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1986. It was not nearly as popular as the NES was, but it was big in South America and Europe and Asia, I believe. Not as much in the United States. But there are some good games here you can play. Uh, there's a series of games called Alex Kidd, which was kind of like their rival to Super Mario Brothers. It was pretty great, and you can also try the original Outrun, which was a big arcade game. And interestingly, there are some games in here that are 3D. The system originally came with a pair of 3D goggles that you could wear while you played the game. Uh, I don't have those, so you can just play the 2D versions of the game instead, but it is kind of interesting. The Atari 7800 was one of Atari's last systems. It was competition for the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System. It came out in 1986. It was a huge improvement in graphics from their previous systems, but a pretty big commercial failure. You see that it only made 57 games for it. Uh, some of the games are pretty great, like Alien Brigade is a first-person shooter game. Uh, a lot of the games are just really good improvements on old games with graphics. Games like Donkey Kong. So, that's pretty much all there is to this system, but it's still pretty great to play. Up next is Game Boy from Nintendo. Still considered one of the best handheld systems of all time. It was the first one. Games were on a bright green screen that was about an inch and a half across, but they were still loved. You'll notice when you play it now, aside from being gigantic and full screened on your big screen TV, the games are now in black and white because the green screen that came with the game isn't on it anymore. So these games were actually originally in black and white. There's some tons of great games on here. You can go with Ninja Turtles is a great game to try. Wario Land, which was the first introduction of Wario. And everybody's favorite game of all time, pretty much, Tetris, which was huge on this system. So up next is the Atari Lynx, which was a handheld system that came out at the same time as Game Boy came out in 1989. And in almost every possible category, the Atari Lynx is the better system than Game Boy was. But it was a little bit more expensive, and Game Boy was incredibly popular, so for some reason Atari Lynx kind of fell to the side. You can see they only made 70 games for it. But in every way it was great. It was a 16-bit system. It had a color screen that was much bigger than Game Boy's. It had a backlight on it, so you could actually play in the dark, which you couldn't do with Game Boy. And strangely, it was reversible, so if you were left-handed, you could flip the system upside down and play with your left hand, which was pretty interesting. There are some great games on here with definitely superior graphics to Game Boy. Lemmings is always great. Everybody knows that game. And Desert Strike was another great one. But there's a lot in here that you can try out. So up next is the Sega Genesis, the first game system in the new 16-bit era. This one came out in 1989, has a ton of games for it. Everybody knows this system, everybody's played it before. There's a lot of classic games in here, like Sonic, the entire Sonic series, Mortal Kombat, the Mortal Kombat series, Echo the Dolphin, and a whole bunch of others that you already know, so I'm not even going to explain them to you. TurboGrafx 16 is next. It came out in 1989 as well. It's also a part of the 16-bit group of games. It was not very popular in the United States. It only made 100 games for it or so. There are some good ones in there, though. There's the Bonk series, which is great, and Bomberman, which everybody knows from other platforms, but it's really great on this system, too.
Up next is probably the most interesting system on the Phoenix. It's the Neo Geo, which came out in 1990 and was by far the most advanced system ever made at the time. It was possible to play it at home and in the arcade. Most people probably ran to it at the arcade. I don't know anyone who owned a home version of it because of the fact that the home version cost $700. And each game for the home version cost over $100. So if you ever ran into a Neo Geo game, odds are it was at the arcade. The games are amazing. Actually, interesting that you have to insert a coin if you want to play them, even on the Phoenix. Some interesting games to try out are King of Fighters and its entire series, and Metal Slug and its entire series. Up next is Super Nintendo, which was the 16-bit system for Nintendo. It was made in 1991. It doesn't really need any explaining. Everybody should know what it is. It was great. There were over 700 games for this one too. Some great ones you should try out are the Donkey Kong Country series, the Kirby series, and possibly the greatest game ever made, Street Fighter 2.
Game Gear is next. It came out in 1991, and it was the last of the original set of handheld systems. It was Sega's version. It has a ton of games. It was really popular. Everybody should know it. It had a color screen, unlike Game Boy. Still wasn't as good as the Atari Lynx, but it was pretty powerful. Games to recommend, I would say the Sonic series, as usual. Super Off-Road is pretty popular, and Land of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse was another big one. Next is the Sega Genesis 32X, which had a very short life. It only existed between 1994 and 1996, and they only made 25 games for it. It was an attachment that went on top of the Genesis and turned it from a 16-bit system into a 32-bit system. and it was not popular at all. It really was basically just games that were already out, but with better graphics. So there was a better version of Mortal Kombat, and also a pretty good version of Spider-Man, and a few other games. Virtual Boy is next. It was made by Nintendo. It came out in 1994, and it was pretty much considered the worst system of all time. It was completely done by 1996, and they only made 14 games for it. It was a virtual reality helmet that you were supposed to wear with 3D games inside of them, and the helmet was so big that it had to be mounted on a stand, and then you had to sit down to play it. And if you played for too long, the 3D image could wreck your eyes after about 15 minutes. So it was a huge disappointment, and nobody liked this or played it ever. Also, all the games are in a blood red color, which makes it really hard to look at for a long period of time. It's a huge disappointment. I just put it on here because I thought it would be fun for people to look at, but I wouldn't recommend playing it ever. If you do want to play, I would tell you to check out Mario's Tennis. That's about the best they have to offer. Next is Nintendo 64, which came out in 1996, and you'll see that there's only 42 games available here instead of the 290 that there's supposed to be. It's a pretty complicated story. It's so complicated that I'm gonna post an entire separate video to walk you through the reason why that is. Game Boy Color's next. The next handheld version by Nintendo came out in 1998, and it was a huge success because it had the color screen finally. This is also the home of Pokemon, so this is where you'll first see that, and that's probably why this system was so popular. Neo Geo Pocket Color is next. It was a handheld system based on Neo Geo. It was not very popular in America, but it was very big in Japan. It came out in 1999. It only lasted a year, and they only made 32 games, but it was still considered pretty successful since the only other system around was Game Boy. There are a few good games in here, not that many. I mean, there's not many to choose from, but there is a pocket version of Metal Slug, which is pretty good. And the last system on the list is Game Boy Advance, which came out in 2001 and lasted all the way until 2007. It had a million games on it, 920. It was crazy. It was just basically just a much better, more advanced version of Game Boy Color. There's lots of millions of games on here that you can choose from. The Pokemon series is hugely popular. Castlevania Aria of Snow is supposed to be a really great game. And Yoshi's Island is also really popular too.